Everyone, fall to your stock. As you know, with these wonderful Zoom things, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And Sam normally does the intro and a welcome. And in this case, I will deputize. You're very welcome to this, our third event of 2022 in the Amherst Irish Association. We're a community group. We say this each time. Our members are probably sick, sore and tired of us giving this incantation. But for those who don't know, we're a community-based, we're all volunteers, and we exist to provide events that explore Irish history, diaspora, culture and language. And we are fueled by the energy of our membership. And I see several folks there today, and fair dues to you. I can see Kathleen and Bill there, and Colby and Kathy, and John Sheehan over in East Hampton, all people who keep us going through their membership subscriptions. We'd also like to acknowledge the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Boston Consulate, who provide us with a grant for us to advertise our events. So if you saw today's event on the local Daily Hampshire Gazette, that was paid for by a grant from the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. So without any further ado, allow me to mention that Annie Rogers, one of our 6 directors, we're a small team. There's Tim, Sam, Ida, Annie, Jonathan and Amanda, a group of amigos, Cordia, with Galir, Fuerin Anava. We're a good team. We enjoy one another's company and we enjoy doing this. And we hope you will enjoy Annie's presentation on her appreciation of Irish poetry, old and new. Take it away, Annie.
Thank you so much, Ida. And don't turn yourself on mute because I'm going to need you shortly.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So this is not by any means an overview of Irish poetry. It's simply my joy in my encounters with Irish poetry that goes a long way back as well as more recently. And I wanted to start with an absolutely gorgeous poem that was written several centuries back. Eileen Dove Niconal, born in 1743, composed this poem. She was a member of the Irish gentry and a poet. And it's a lament in the Irish language. It was this lament tradition was established for centuries before this one came along. This was one of the first ones to be written down. They were traditionally always delivered by women. And it's perhaps, some people have said, and I'm not surprised, the greatest poem to come out of Ireland in the 18th century. Eileen composed it on the death of her husband, Art O'Leary, and he died on the 4th of May, 1773. Just a little bit of history. Having served in the Austro-Hungarian War, Art returned home to Ireland with the gift of a magnificent horse. At the time, under the terms of the penal laws, as a Catholic, he was forbidden to own a horse worth more than £5. He refused to sell the horse to a Protestant, Abraham Morris, a magistrate in Macroon, who in turn became responsible for Art's murder in County Cork. Recently, this poem has come back into Irish culture through a renewed interest to the Irish poet Doireann na Gríofa and her recent 2020 book. I recommend this really, really strongly. It has a beautiful title. It's called A Ghost in the Throat. In this book, it's a combination of innovative memoir, her own experience as a woman, as she considers her relationship with this masterpiece written centuries before, and as she tries to discover more of the story of its author, Eileen Dove Niconal. To give you a flavor of the work, what I wanted to do is bring you the opening verse, where she first remembers laying eyes on Art, and then another verse where she learns of his death. And I've asked Ada, she would please read the lines first in English, and then I'll read them it's first in Irish, that was a slip. And then I'll read them in English using Duran's translation. So Ada, please.
Magro godangan tú, Lord of Vakatu with county and Varga. Hogmahul erodit, Hogmachri tanavdit, Delius caridlat, Ivad ovalialat.
So here's the translation. And it loses some of the beauty of the sounds of repetition, but still, it's a good translation. Oh, my beloved, steadfast and true, the day I first saw you by the market's thatched roof, how my eye took a shine to you, how my heart took delight in you. I fled my companions with you to soar far from home with you.
Macharat hu godangan is near credis riv dat varav gur honig huim de chapel is na shriante lehi gotalav. Is will de chrier a lachen sheer gotalet grante maraviti it three is it hassive. Hogus leim gotarshig an dara leim gogata an triu leim de chapel.
Oh, my steady companion, never could I have believed you deceased until she came to me, your steed, with her reins trailing the cobbles, and your heart's blood smeared from cheek to saddle, where you'd sit and even stand, my daredevil. 3 leaps I took, first to the threshold, the second to the gate, the third to your mare. And it is. I so recommend this poem. It's one of the poems in even though I don't have Irish, that I really fell in love with Irish poetry. And I want to begin by actually turning to the poet, our own poet, Emily Dickinson here in Amherst. And one of the things that Emily said that I absolutely love is about poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know this is poetry. And the poet, Billy Collins, Irish-American poet, poetry, he writes, perhaps even a single poem, has the ability to make us dance even if we remain in our seats, make us sing even if we remain silent. So he refers to the physicality of the bodily felt sense of the music in poetry. And from Seamus Heaney, writing poetry, he says, you end up dropping back through your own trap doors with a kind of they can't take this away from me feeling. As I said in the beginning, I just want to take a little tour through some of the Irish poems that I have encountered and make a few little comments about them as I go. This is meant to be a reading just for the joy of the poems themselves. And there is no right or wrong way of hearing. The way that you hear will have your own signature. So one of the earliest poems that I discovered and poets was, of course, William Butler Yeats. He was born in 1865 in Sandymount. He was a Sligo poet. He died in 1939. He's also a Nobel Prize winning poet. So this is from an early poem called A Stolen Child. And I'll just do the first part and then pause and talk a little. Where dips the rocky highland of Sleuthwood in the lake, there lies a leafy island where flapping herons wake the drowsy water rats. There they've hid their fairy vats full of berries and of reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. And one of the things that first intrigued me about this poem is that it was nothing like an idea of fairies that I had grown up with and as an Irish-American school kid. These fairies were sinister. They were uncanny. They were of another world. They lived on this isolated lake. and the flapping heron wakes the drowsy water rats. And not only do they have fairy vats full of berries, but also full of stolen cherries. And there's something about this child lured away because the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Something of the sorrow, the grief of the world that's too much for the child. And when I first read it, I thought this was about a child being lured away. And only much later did I read it as a poem about a child's death and the other world that's created through this world of the island that Yeats creates. Another part of the poem goes, you'll hear no more the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside, or the kettle on the hob singing peace into his breast, or see the brown mice bob round and round the oatmeal chest. For he's come, the human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, from a world more full of weeping than he can understand. So you can understand how I might interpret it as a poem about death and another world. Also, it's one of the earliest poems that I learned by heart because it has a structure of these of rhyme and rhythm that makes it very easy to do so. And I was intrigued with the poem. So the second poem by Yeats that really spoke to me was The Wild Swans at Pool. And by then I was a college student and I encountered it in a course on Irish poetry. And I'll just read again the beginning of it. The trees are in their autumn beauty. The woodland paths are dry. Under the October twilight, the water mirrors a still sky. Upon the brimming water, among the stones are 59 swans. The 19th autumn has come upon me since I first made my count. I saw, before I had well finished, all suddenly mount and scatter, wheeling in great broken rings upon their clamorous wings. When I first read this, as with the earlier poetry, I was taken by the music of it. When you read those lines, all suddenly mount and scatter, wheeling in great broken rings upon their clamorous wings. You can practically hear the wings beating. But I also made a mistaken interpretation, which was I was 19 years old at the time, and I identified the position of the poet. So I thought, oh, this is Yeats at 19 years old counting the swans, never thinking, well, he would have had to have begun at birth, highly unlikely. But the second error I made was to assume that every poem that was written was spoken by the author, that there's no such thing as a character, a speaker, or persona who might speak in lieu of the poet. And as I go on with other poems, you'll actually hear this more clearly. But nonetheless, my 19-year-old misinterpretation gave me great joy. And in the end, that is all that matters with poetry. The next poem that I really explored with Yeats was Easter 1916. And again, I first read it as a kind of patriotic poem about the sacrifices and the victory of the Irish in the uprising. But on subsequent readings, I read it very differently. So let me read just some little excerpts from it. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone, to trouble a living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim, and a horse plashes within it. The long-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse, MacDonough and MacBride, and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. So if you trace it backwards, first of all, he doesn't say a beauty was born or a victory is born. He says a terrible beauty is born. And it's one of the things that I love about poetry and poets is this capacity to put things together, two things together that don't belong, and to make them work on us in a different way because they've been put together that way. But also refers to are changed utterly. And it goes back to the changes of that first verse, which are not only narrated, but are in the language itself. So you can hear these minute little shifts in the language, from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. The shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. And then we come to the long-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call, minute by minute they live. The stone's in the midst of them all. So we have the stone, and if you go back to the beginning, he begins with hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone. So what is it to have a heart enchanted to a stone? And enchanted to a stone, bewildered with an excess of love that results in their death. And when I read this poem now, when I bring it to you today, I think so much of the Ukrainian soldiers and the people of Ukraine right now, and how with a kind of devotion to a cause, to a love of a cause, you, in a sense, and the brutality of all the things that you face, that the only way to get through it is to, in a sense, turn the heart to stone. So it's not an easy, victorious kind of poem. It's really complicated about what happens to the human under conditions of war. Anyway, I love this poem. That's not all of it. Maybe you'll want to read more of it. There are so many Irish poets that I've fallen in love with, but Seamus Heaney could not be left out of this reading. He was born in Castledawson in Northern Ireland in 1939. So he's born in the year of Yeats' death, which I think is really interesting. He died in 2013 in Blackrock, Dublin. He was another Nobel Prize winning Irish poet. And one of my favorite poems by Seamus Heaney is a poem called The Given Note. And I read it as what poets call an ars poetica, a poem that's about the writing and reading of poetry itself. And again, what's going to happen in this poem, well, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to read it and then I'll talk about it. The Given Note. On the most westerly blasket, in a dry stone hut, he got this air out of the night. Strange noises were heard by others who followed, bits of a tune coming in on loud weather, though nothing like melody. He blamed their fingers and ear as unpracticed, their fiddling easy, for he had gone alone to the island and brought back the whole thing. The house throbbed like his full violin. So whether he calls it spirit music or not, I don't care. He took it out of wind off mid-Atlantic. Still, he maintains, from nowhere. It comes off the bow gravely, rephrases itself into the air. And again, one of the things that I love about this poem is you'll notice that there are not these strict end rhymes anymore. The rhymes are embedded within the lines, but the metric, the music of it still really is very, very strong. But one of the things I love about it is that Seamus invents these others, these musicians, as if they were on the island with him, until he says, oh, he came to the island alone. And then there's a he taking this music out of the air, who's in that experience. And then there's an I. He says, so whether he calls it spirit music or not, I don't care. He took it out of the wind off mid-Atlantic. Still, he maintains, from nowhere. It comes off the bow gravely, rephrases itself into the air. So he creates this curious and wonderful division between the poet receiving and the poet responding to what's received in the process of writing a poem. Another poem that I read as an ars poetica, as a very different poem about writing poetry by famous Seamus, as they call him in Ireland, is called Saint Kevin and the Blackbird. And it's short. I'll read it in its entirety. It's an amazing little poem. Saint Kevin and the Blackbird. And then there was Saint Kevin and the Blackbird. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out inside his cell, but the cell is narrow. So one upturned palm is out the window, stiff as a crossbeam, when a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tucked neat head and claws, and finding himself linked into a network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. And since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, so here comes the poet interrupting himself, imagine being Kevin. Which is he, self-forgetful or in agony all the time? From the neck on down through his hurting forearms, are his fingers sleeping? Does he still feel his knees? Or has the shut-eyed blank of under-earth crept up through him? Is there distance in his head? Alone and mirrored clear in love's deep river, to labor and not to seek reward, he prays, a prayer his body makes entirely. For he has forgotten self, forgotten bird, and on the riverbank, forgotten the river's name. And again, part of what I really love about this poem is the poet's identification with St. Kevin, the interruption of the poet thinking about the whole position of St. Kevin, but in the end, the way in which in writing poetry, the poet has to make this curious disappearance of self, of ego, of all kinds of commitments, and a pre-knowledge of the names of things to hear them differently. The next poet I'm going to read is Evan Boland, who's a Dublin poet, born in 1944. She died in 2020. She was a Stanford professor from 1996 to her death, and she moved back and forth between Dublin and Palo Alto. She wrote a really beautiful book that I found in the 1990s called Object Lessons, which was about the women's place as a poet in the tradition of Irish poetry, which is to say there wasn't any. Despite Eileen Dove McConnell's early and extraordinarily skillful poem. And so Evan Boland takes up the position of the woman and the mother in Irish poetry, and she's also an extraordinarily skilled poet. So I'm going to read from a very long poem, just some sections. It's called Anna Liffey, the river that runs through Dublin. Life, the story goes, was the daughter of Canaan and came to the plain of Kildare. She loved the flatlands and the ditches and the unreachable horizon. She asked that it be named for her. The river took its name from the land took its name from a woman in the doorway of a house, a river in the city of her birth. There in the hills above my house, the river Liffey rises, is a source. It rises in rush and ling heather and black peat and bracken and strengthens to claim the city it narrated. Swans, steep falls, small towns, the smudged air and bridges of Dublin. Dusk is coming. Rain is moving east from the hills. If I could see myself, I would see a woman in a doorway wearing the colors that go with red hair, although my hair is no longer red. I praise the gifts of the river, its shiftless and glittering retelling of a city, its clarity as it flows, in the company of runt flowers and herons, around a bend at Island Bridge, and under 13 bridges to the sea. Its patience at twilight, swans nesting in it. Swans nesting by it, Nian, wincing into it. And then it goes on, it's a long poem, but I'm going to the last verse. In the end, it will not matter that I was a woman, I'm sure of it. The body is a source, nothing more. There's a time for it. There's a certainty about the way it seeks its own dissolution. Consider rivers. They are always en route to their own nothingness. From the first moment, they are going home. And so when language cannot do it for us, cannot make us know love will not diminish us, there are these phrases of the ocean to console us, particular and unafraid of their completion. In the end, everything that burdened and distinguished me will be lost in this. I was a voice. And again, it speaks back to the nothingness, the dissolution of St. Kevin and with his blackbird, the nothingness of the tune taken out of the air for famous Seamus. And after this lifetime of devoting herself to establishing herself as a woman poet, in the end, it will not matter that I was a woman. I am sure of it. I was a voice. And as I read it, it's so strange because I've listened to Yvonne Boland herself reciting it. So I hear her voice in the rhythms of what I read. The next poet I'm going to read is Paula Meehan, another Dublin-born poet, and someone I actually met in 1997 when she offered a poetry workshop at Trinity College in Dublin. She was the Ireland Chair of Poetry in 1996 and produced a beautiful, beautiful book called something about bees.
Bees in their bonnets.
Yeah, not quite, but close to it. It's a really, really beautiful, beautiful book about her thinking about Irish poetry and the place and of our own poetry in it. Yeah, if you Google Paula Meehan and bees and bonnets, you'll find it. So this is one of my favorite poems, and often a poet will write back to another poet, and this is for Brendan Kennelly, another Irish poet. That's the attribution, and the title is From My Father as a Vision of St. Francis, which also speaks a little bit back to St. Kevin's poem. It was the piebald horse in the next door's garden frightened me out of a dream with her dawn whinny. Let me begin again, because I shouldn't have broken the line there. Oh, something interrupted me. Okay, I got interrupted by some tech. You're all still there. I'm going to begin again. Paula Meehan, My Father as a Vision of St. Francis. It was the piebald horse in the next door's garden frightened me out of a dream with her dawn whinny. I was back in the box room of the house, my brother's room now, full of ties and sweaters and secrets. Bottles clinked on the doorstep. The first bus pulled up to the stop. The rest of the house slept, except for my father. I heard him rake the ash from the grate, plug in the kettle, hum a snatch of a tune. Then he unlocked the back door and stepped out into the garden. Autumn was nearly done. The first frost whitened the slates of the estate. He was older than I had reckoned, his hair completely silver. And for the first time, I saw the stoop of his shoulder, saw that his leg was stiff. What's he at? So early, and still stars in the west. They came then, birds of every size, shape, color. They came from the hedges and shrubs, from eaves and garden sheds, from the industrial estate outlying fields. From Doubercross they came, and the ditches of the North Road. The garden was a pandemonium. When my father threw up his hands and tossed the crumbs to the air, the sun cleared O'Reilly's chimney, and he was suddenly radiant, a perfect vision of St. Francis made whole, made young again in a fingless garden. I think it's just a brilliant poem. Its rhythms, the fact that it's in inner city Dublin, the fact that I know Finglas, that I've met the poet again. I wish that I could carry her voice because she has a very strong Dublin accent, but c'est la vie. The next one is also a Dublin poet. This is a Nigerian Irish poet, the youngest of the poets I'm bringing to you today. In fact, the only young poet I'm bringing. Chiamaka Enyi Amadi is a Lagos, Nigerian-born, Galway-raised. She came to Galway when she was 10, and Dublin-based writer, spoken word artist, poet, editor, columnist. She graduated from University College Dublin with an honors BA in both English and philosophy. Her work has been published both online and in print journals, including some pretty hefty journals like Poetry International, Poetry Ireland Review. She's been on an RTE poetry program, and she's published by, I love the name of this, Smithereens Press. She was asked to create a written response to an exhibition at IMA, the Irish Museum of Modern Art, in 2019, for an exhibition called A Fiction Close to Reality. And I'm going to read just one of those 3 poems called Fear, in part because it speaks back to me to a stolen child. Fear, Chiamaka Enyi Amadi. Once upon a time, a young child drifted off to sleep, curled up on her father's warm chest, as was the predictable end to their nightly ritual of storytelling. She slept and dreamt all night long of an animal named Fear, who caught and swallowed her on her way back to her father's voice, clasping its coarse red claws around her eyes, pouring a whisper soft as smoke into her ear. You have lost your way, child, never to return back to the world. True enough, the road she had followed, illuminated by the velvety glow of her nightlight, no longer lay before her wide eyes. And without warning, reality vanished as a thin line drawn in sand, swiftly carried away by an impatient wind. So interesting to me. And again, the mark of a real poet at the end, she doesn't say an impatient wind, she says an impatient wind with all of its connotations. And the next poet I'm going to turn to is a more established poet. She's a Sligo poet, again, a poet that I know. She's a teacher, a poet, a musician. She's winner of the Kavanagh Fellowship for Poetry in 2008. Her name is Mary Branley. And I'm going to choose 2 poems from her most recent book called A Pinch of Snow in a Black Velvet Glove. And the title poem of the book, I'm just going to read a little bit of it because it's a lament poem, as was the poem that we began with, Lament for Art O'Leary. And it says something about the time in history. She's at a funeral for her father. So I'll just read the beginning part of this. A pinch of snow in a black velvet glove. 1. The miner's path stretched back into the past for us, and up Ben Bulben that January morning. The day was black and white and every shade of gray, like a photo from the 30s, with grim-jawed, black-shawled, long-skirted women and children in bare feet. We came to our grandparents' home, Thurmore, Glencar, still roofed but hearthless, grooved in the valley and blind to the lake, the slopes, the bay. We remembered the story of their wedding day. The church was ringed with soldiers on the run. The best man couldn't join them at the altar, so a modest laborer stood in, long socks to the knee. The married couple jaunted home to the table, spread with sweet cake and stout, a spray of late roses from the wild briar backed by fern. The bride was shown how to hold a black revolver in her white wedding glove, how to steady her eye, her hand, and braced against her husband. She practiced on a plank of wood all day. It's a beautiful poem. I won't read the whole thing, just in terms of time. And also there's another one I picked out from this volume that I really want to read, because one of the things that it brings, it really heightens, is, again, the sound of poetry, the play with language. It doesn't have to make sense for it to work as a poem. So if you spend a lot of time trying to discern the meaning of a poem, let alone rephrase it, decide what it's about, good night, Irene, forget it with this one. This is just pure play. It's called Orchidence. And there's a little quote that opens it from George Mackey Brown. After that God-sent storm, I find peace here. And again, it brings me back to the given note. Here's the poem. Peaty stack, muckle stack, thurl door, a trio of witches' hats on the mermaid North Sea brink. Further out than song, a rasp. Totty, groti, buckles picked at the shore for luck. It's a little bit to get your mouth around, so let me just read it one more time, a little faster. Peaty stack, muckle stack, thurl door, a trio of witches' hats on the mermaid North Sea brink. Further out than song, a rasp. Toady, grody, buckies picked at the shore for luck. This would feel incomplete to me in some sense if I didn't also take the step of reading a couple of my own poems, one written in Amherst, one in Ireland. Clearly, I'm not an Irish poet, I'm Irish American, but I spent enough time in Ireland that I want to claim the Irish bit too. The first poem is called Karaninsky, County Mayo, 1995. Between the notes of song, you name them. Clare Island, Inishark, Killadoon, Jeffrey Hill, and Croag Patrick, 2 interval islands, a distant town, 2 mountains. Braced against a rock ledge, away from wind and driven rain, rain our kisses, we never made Clew Bay. A blessing of light fell on uneven grasses, after night rehearsed this bog, and from its traces blue island masses issued forth the first horn notes. You began here, in this bog. We walked 4 miles to the village for food and fuel, past drying turf heaped high on bog, where darkened forms of hunger walked abroad in silence. After sudden rain, I loved the idiom of the place because your voice was of that idiom. And the second poem, I and other local poets were invited to hang out in Emily Dickinson's bedroom. Ida was also invited into this collection. To hang out in Emily Dickinson's bedroom and to spend an hour there when it was all stripped back to the barest essentials, right down to the room that she would have experienced, much closer to that than all the renovations. So as I hung out there, I didn't know that I was creating anything very much at all. I kind of paced around and looked out from various windows, and I noticed that she had some papers lying about, little scraps of paper, and that inspired me. And I noticed among them were the names of various chocolatiers, and I thought, oh, she liked chocolate. And I became so entranced with the whole thing that I almost got locked in for the night because I forgot to come out and tell the people I was still there in the room. Anyway, out of this is the poem that came. Emily in her room. Dusk envelops the room. You turn a tiny circle. Cloth tongue sticks out. You strike the light. Gray floorboards, a wall, and sudden table waver. You turn a cold doorknob infinitesimally into its own tense orbit. The hinge complains. voices far below. You return the folded poem, a scrap in your pocket. You will not cross the threshold. This room makes a satisfying little orbit. Your life hinged here with flickering lines. The hedge below is dense with bees, lavender freighted music, clogged with music you write. Every word shines, scribbles into which everything folds. The turn, return, the hinge, the orbit. If I was going to say, go read anything of Emily Dickinson, especially if you've not read her for a long time. See if you can get your hands on a book called The Gorgeous Nothings, which are her envelope poems and her scrap paper poems. They will not fit into neat little verses without ruining what she's done. And it was partly picturing her with these scraps of paper in her various pockets, walking around gathering thoughts, that really inspired that particular poem. So that's it. That's it for me. That's the whole shebang. And I did want to save a little bit of time at the end for any questions and responses. So I'm going to pause there, stop there. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening.
Do you want to ask people to raise their hands, Annie?
Oh, yes, please. There's a small enough group that you don't need to do the mechanical hand. If you wave at me, I'll see you. Okay, Tim. Tim, you're on mute.
I'm trying to get there. I have a question about the one poem, and maybe that I missed it, but the one that was talking about the bride and the gun.
Yeah.
What was that? That was in reference to some kind of conflict or war? What was the reason that she was doing that? Or was that just just supposed to be a striking difference between the two kinds of events?
No, you're quite right. It refers back to a history. So this is the burial of Mary Branley's father, who would have been old, and his own parents, and their wedding would have been around the time or pre the time of the rising in Ireland, and they were at war. They were at war.
Okay, so she was being trained at the same time that she was being wed?
Well, the poet takes the story from the family, which
Okay.
was that she was being trained the day that she was being wed. Yes.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Very good. That was kind of a shock when you mentioned black gun. I was really
Yeah,
was
and I
just
think
such a
I think the
surprise.
poet means it to be a shock, because it's not what you think is going to come.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. That was a great piece. Great piece.
Thank you. Mary Branley.
Annie, John Shan, I have a question for you.
Hello, John.
How you doing?
I'm doing well.
That poem at the beginning grabbed my attention about the lament for Arthur O'Leary and the horse, and the law that said Irish Catholics couldn't own a horse worth more than 5 pounds. Could you briefly tell that story to remind me of the ending? Because when I first heard it, I was struck by, that the laws of oppression of the Irish by the English was so detailed that get down to the value of a horse could not be more than 5 pounds. And didn't a British gentleman kill him or take his horse away from him?
The person who had him killed, because he wouldn't give up this horse. Hang on, I have to go back to my notes. Ida, you might want to fill this in while I'm looking.
the penal laws. It's one of the conditions of the penal laws, John. So the penal laws were in place as a mechanism of oppression, and you're right, they were so detailed that no Catholic could own a horse of a value more than £5. And if a Protestant offered to buy that horse, they had to sell it to them. And Arthur Leary had just come back from being a general in the Austro-Hungarian War, so he was full of notions and the gentry, and he wasn't going to sell the horse.
And he was given this horse. It was a gorgeous horse.
Yes.
And it was Abraham Morris, who was a magistrate and a Protestant. So yes, whether he identified as English or Irish, he was a magistrate that was on the English side, who was responsible for the murder of Arthur Leary. Yeah. Yeah, and the penal laws, right down, you're quite right, right down to the what kind of a horse you could have and how much it was worth. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
There's now someone began to say so, and I don't know if that's you,
Kathleen. I'm
Kathleen,
Kathleen.
lovely. Okay, Kathleen.
Well, would you be able to put this list of poetry that you've read today into an email so that we have a record of it and can go look for these books that you've mentioned and authors?
Sure, I can
Okay.
I can send it to Tim, who will send it out with the email.
I would have to say I've not been a drawn person to poetry, but one poem that really stands to me, and I can't bring up the poem or the artist, but it's about a very great artist who was confined to his home and wrote about his backyard. Does anyone remember that one at all?
Sean O'Riordan.
Okay. He was confined to home and he wrote about his backyard, right, John?
Yes, he was confined during the TB epidemic
Right.
in Ireland, where he had it, and so he was confined to
Yeah.
a place in the backyard.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's-
there are so many really, really wonderful Irish poets, and you know, for somebody who has a sensibility, there's nothing like a long illness and isolation,
Mhm.
not unlike the pandemic as a kind of greenhouse or a forcing house for poems. So
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Okay.
Anyone else? We probably have time for maybe just one or two more.
I was wondering, Annie, if you'd speak to the influence of poetry on your other work in the world, and vice versa.
Yeah, that's a gorgeous question and a kind of huge question for me. I am a psychoanalyst, and the way that I practice is through the work of Jacques Lacan, and it involves really attuning my ear to language, including the unexpected sound pairings of words at the level of the phoneme even. So the fact that I like to write poetry and read poetry really helps out with that listening. It's a way of tracing what's emerging in the unconscious in a way that's pretty extraordinary experience, both for me and for Anna Alazan, someone who's lying on the couch trying to figure out what's going on. I'm also a printmaker, and I like to draw. I've drawn and made little watercolors since way back forever. And almost as soon as I begin to make something visually, I'm almost compelled to find some accompanying bit of words that will go with it. And it almost always takes some kind of lyric turn. It may or may not turn into a poem, but it happens over and over and over again. So yeah, thank you for that question. And there's probably other ways that poetry comes into my work that I'm not aware of. Well, thank you everyone. Again, we will send you the list of poems. Thank you for listening. And I hope that you felt some of the joy in the poetry this afternoon. And over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Annie. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to wrap things up in ending here. We want to thank our speaker and AIA director, Annie Rogers, for sharing some really wonderful Irish poetry here to pick up an otherwise kind of dismal day. I know myself that I heard many of these poems today for the very, very first time, and I was struck by them. So thank you, Annie, for sharing with all of us. Thanks as always to the Consul General of Ireland in Boston, Leisha Moore, and to the Immigrant Support Program for their steadfast and continued support of our programming. And as Ida mentioned earlier, thanks also to our other AIA directors, Ida herself, Sam Hannigan, Amanda Bernhard, and Jonathan Kennedy for all the work that they do regularly behind the scenes you just don't get to see. We have one more program left for the spring of 2022, an Irish language workshop with Amanda and Jonathan on Sunday, May the 15th. No previous experience with Gaeilge is required, so Biggie Lynn, please join us there. Remember, if you haven't yet renewed your AIA membership for 2022, you aren't too late. Surprisingly enough, you can find a membership application to print on our website at any time at www.amherstirish.org. And we're doing our bit to fight inflation by maintaining that pre-pandemic membership fee of just $25. So that hasn't changed. On a very different note, I'd like to mention in sorrow, the passing of a longtime AIA member, Margaret Christofek, who passed away earlier this month. Margaret and her husband, Tony, were fixtures of our in-person sessions and always stayed around afterwards for tea and scones. We'd like to extend our deepest sympathies to Tony and his family. She'll be missed. And the last thank you is for all of you for having taken some time out of your day to be with us. We appreciate that. And so now as we leave, I want to pass off one more quick Irish poem in the form of this farewell blessing for all of you. May love and laughter light your days and warm your heart and home. May good and faithful friends be yours wherever you may roam. May peace and plenty bless your world with joy that long endures. May all life's passing seasons be the best to you and yours. And with that said, Slán Abhaile. Take care.
Good at me on Mahagat.
Same to you, John. And Maureen.